November 1932. Tokyo was awake, but it was not at peace. I imagine the morning air first, cold metallic, carrying the smell of coal smoke and damp stone. Government buildings loomed over narrow streets, their shadows stretching long across the pavement. Officers in crisp uniforms moved with confidence, sabers at their sides, boots striking the ground in perfect rhythm. This was Imperial Japan at a moment of outward discipline and inward tension. And in that daylight, amid the certainty of rank and ritual, something unseen walked calmly toward them. I have spent years studying weapons that announce themselves with thunder, artillery, bombs, torpedoes. But this story is different. This weapon did not roar. It did not flash. It waited. It hid in plain sight. And when it struck, it did so with terrifying intimacy. I am speaking of what many later called the invisible Japanese sword, a concealed blade designed not for the battlefield, but for ambush, assassination, and psychological domination in broad daylight. At first, even historians struggled to define it. There was no single factory name stamped into its steel, no standard designation issued by the Army Ministry. That, in itself, was part of its power. This was not merely a weapon. It was a method, a philosophy of violence shaped by secrecy, tradition, and the ruthless needs of empire. I remember the first police report I read describing its use. The language was dry, bureaucratic, almost embarrassed. An officer collapsed suddenly. Witnesses did not observe a weapon. Blood appeared only after the man had already fallen. It was as if the blade itself had been invisible. Slowly, the truth emerged. The weapon was a concealed sword, most commonly a shikamizu, a sword hidden inside what appeared to be an ordinary walking cane, umbrella, or staff. In other cases, it was disguised within scabbards that looked ceremonial or blunt, or built into objects no one thought to fear. To Western eyes, it seemed almost theatrical. To Japanese operatives, it was brutally practical. To understand why such a weapon existed, I must take you back further, to the problem Imperial Japan faced between the wars. By the 1920s and 1930s, Japan was expanding aggressively across Asia. But conquest was not only a matter of armies. It was also a matter of control, of suppressing dissent, eliminating rivals, and enforcing obedience in occupied cities where open violence could spark rebellion or international outrage. Guns were loud. Guns drew attention. Guns invited witnesses, investigations, and consequences. But a sword could kill silently, instantly, and leave confusion behind. Japan already possessed centuries of sword culture. The katana was not just a weapon, it was a symbol of authority, discipline, and moral right. By adapting that tradition into concealed forms, the Japanese military and secret police found a solution that fit both their operational needs and their cultural worldview. The technical ingenuity of these swords was remarkable. I have handled surviving examples in archives, and even now they unsettle me. A typical shikamizu contained a blade between 60 and 70 centimeters long, shorter than a battlefield katana, but more than enough for lethal thrusts. The blade was straight or very slightly curved, optimized for stabbing rather than slashing in confined spaces. There was no guard, no tsuba, nothing to signal danger. The sheath was seamless, often made of lacquered wood or metal, designed to look like an innocuous cane. Some were fitted with rubber tips, worn down deliberately to enhance the illusion of harmlessness. The grip was hidden within the handle, released by a subtle twist or pull that could be performed in a single fluid motion. In trained hands, the draw time was less than a second. This mattered because these weapons were not meant for duels. They were meant for ambush. The typical technique involved closing distance under a pretext, asking for directions, presenting documents, or simply walking past an unsuspecting target. The blade would be driven upward beneath the ribs or into the abdomen, angled to puncture vital organs while minimizing external bleeding. Victims often did not realize they had been stabbed until their strength failed. I have read accounts from Chinese police officers in occupied Shanghai describing such attacks. One moment, a Japanese civilian, or what appeared to be one, stood beside them. The next, they felt sudden warmth, and then weakness. Only later did blood soak their uniforms. Operationally, these swords were used by Kempeitai agents, intelligence operatives, and sometimes military officers conducting special duties. In Manchuria, they were employed to eliminate anti-Japanese organizers without provoking public firefights. In Korea, they were used to intimidate resistance figures, reinforcing the idea that nowhere was safe, not even the street at noon. One particularly chilling anecdote comes from Nanjing in 1938. A Chinese collaborator, accused of leaking information, was summoned to what he believed was a routine meeting. As he walked beside his escort through a government courtyard, he collapsed. Witnesses initially thought he had fainted. Only when blood pooled beneath him did they understand. The escort continued walking, cane in hand, disappearing into the crowd. No arrest was ever recorded. The psychological impact of these weapons was immense. Fear spread not because people saw them, but because they did not. Rumors circulated of ghost blades, of Japanese officers who could kill without weapons. Even armed guards grew tense, unsure what to watch for. A rifle could be seen. A sword cane could not. I have always believed that warfare is as much about the mind as the body, and here Japan demonstrated that principle with terrifying clarity. The invisible sword created paranoia. People avoided crowds. They feared strangers. They feared silence. Yet the weapon also exacted a toll on those who carried it. Japanese training manuals emphasized emotional detachment. Operatives were taught to strike without hesitation, to withdraw without reaction. But memoirs written decades later reveal cracks in that discipline. One former Kempeitai officer described how he avoided eye contact afterward, haunted by the feeling of the blade entering flesh without resistance. "It was too easy," he wrote. "That is what frightened me. When I compare this weapon to those used by other nations, its uniqueness becomes clear." Britain relied on pistols and garrotes for covert killings. Germany favored suppressed firearms and explosives. The Soviet NKVD used knives, but rarely concealed in such elaborate disguises. Only Japan combined ancient swordsmanship with modern espionage so seamlessly. Even the famous British Fairbairn, Sykes' fighting knife, elegant and deadly as it was, could not match the psychological effect of a weapon no one could see. The invisible sword also reflected Japan's strategic mindset. It was economical. No ammunition required. It was reliable. Steel does not jam. And it aligned with the Bushido, inspired belief that killing at close range demonstrated resolve and moral superiority. But history is unforgiving. As the war turned against Japan, these swords could not stop tanks, aircraft, or naval bombardment. By 1945, many were destroyed, hidden, or melted down. Their very secrecy ensured their disappearance from the record. What survived did so by accident, forgotten in attics, seized by Allied troops who scarcely understood what they had captured. When I stand back now, examining the legacy of the invisible sword, I see more than a weapon. I see a warning. It reminds me that the most frightening tools of war are not always the loudest or largest. Sometimes, they are the ones designed to disappear, to kill and leave only questions behind. In daylight, among uniforms and routine, this sword turned certainty into vulnerability. It blurred the line between civilian and soldier, between safety and danger. And in doing so, it revealed something essential about Imperial Japan's war. A conflict fought not only on battlefields, but in shadows cast by ordinary streets. That is why, even today, the invisible sword still unsettles me. Not because of its steel, but because of what it represents. A deliberate choice to weaponize surprise, tradition, and fear itself.